light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. During the years I was growing up, I sometimes heard about a phenomenon called the generation gap. And if I understand correctly, it's that there are young people and there are elderly people, and the two don't understand each other. But as I thought about that, it seems that the generation gap is a challenge for every generation, and that it's not just something that happens at any one point in time. During the teenage years, there's a natural tendency to push toward individuation, that where one has been the child of one's parents for the longest, for 10, 15 years, for 10, 15, 20 years, however many years at which the person begins to think, I need to be myself. For some people, it happens very early in childhood. For some, it happens late in their teenage years. And then I've met some people for whom it seems to have never happened. But ideally, there is a time that I think is supposed to be in your latter teenage years where you begin to learn how to be an individual and to not always depend upon your parents for everything. And ideally, the parents would try to encourage this actually from a much younger age, understanding that they won't always be there to provide guidance or wisdom or shelter or anything else. And so they have to teach their children from day one how to be independent. But you don't teach independence by engaging in neglect. There is a nurturing and a mentoring that needs to happen. And if that nurturing and mentoring is happening, it can also involve the grandparents. In tribal societies, the grandparents would be the wise elders. But the thing to remember about tribal societies is that children grew up knowing that when they reached that age, they would be the wise elders and people would be coming to them for advice, and so they probably better know what sort of answer to give by the time they got there. Otherwise, time would pass no matter what. They would wind up being as old as their grandparents. That was, unless they got killed or didn't live that long, that's what would happen. And at that point, they would be expected to have accumulated that many years of wisdom. Well, as they say, no one's completely useless. They can always serve as a bad example. One of the things that keeps me going as time passes and I continue to age, the thing that reminds me to do the exercises, to do my aerobics, to eat healthy, to refrain from the various addictions that have a negative effect on the body, whether it's smoking or alcoholism or drug abuse or whatever it is. All I have to do is look at a certain segment of the elderly population, at people who didn't do their exercises and who smoked endlessly and who drank excessively and all those sorts of things and didn't eat healthy foods. And all of that is catching up to them now that they're elderly and they're having more health problems than they ever dreamed. And they're describing themselves in terms of diminished ability. And somebody asked me once, well, what's your family medical history? And I said, it doesn't matter, because none of them have done what I've done. Eating healthy, exercising regularly, continuing to exercise regularly, and knowing that it's so much easier to maintain than to recover lost ground. If you don't exercise at all until you're 50 or 60, you're going to have a lot of lost ground to recover. Even if you don't exercise until age 50 or 60, however, there's still a lot of ability that can be had with an intelligent exercise program, even at that age. But if you start early in life, there's a lot of lost ground, a lot of negative effects that you won't be coping with. because you've never allowed them to happen. But doing that requires being attentive one day at a time all the way through. The generation gap seems to very much tie into the breakdown of the family, that the grandparents weren't there as the wise tribal elders like tribal societies in the past, or that the people who became the grandparents did not adequately prepare themselves to be the wise elders. They didn't think in terms of someday, as young as I am, even if I'm only 15 right now, someday, if I live long enough, I'm going to have to explain this to my grandchildren. What am I going to tell them? Especially when they're looking at me saying, well, you're so old, how do you know what I'm going through? Well, one of the ways they could respect that is if you actually were willing to share with them the struggles, if you were willing to, first of all, remember the struggles that you go through. Don't shove them away and try to forget them. All of these struggles are what make you who you are. When you can transform them into something good, then you have that much more insight to pass along to the next generation. But never assume that the next generation isn't learning a phenomenal number of things on its own also. In a way, it's a kind of a symbiotic relationship. For those who are unfamiliar with the term, a symbiotic relationship is where each contributes something that the other needs that the other can't generate itself. The most obvious example is the way that plants breathe oxygen and plants exhale oxygen and humans exhale carbon dioxide. Well, the plants need the carbon dioxide and the humans need the oxygen. Neither one of them can produce what they need, and so in order for both to survive, in order for either one to survive, both have to be present. There's growing concern about the destruction of the rainforests of the planet because those are what have been generating the abundance of oxygen in our atmosphere so that the air remains breathable for human beings. If we eliminated all plants from the planet, we would have to figure out some other way to generate oxygen, and I'm not sure whether or not we could in adequate quantities, because the plants are generating the oxygen which we have to survive, and we're generating the carbon dioxide which they have to have. In terms of familial structures, the youth bring strength and energy and vision and ingenuity. The elders bring experience and maturity and stability and calmness. And let's think things through, because what looks like a disaster may or may not be. We won't know until it gets to this point, and it may not get to that point. It would be kind of like when I was growing up in Wisconsin. Occasionally in the summertime there would be tornadoes. Tornadoes move so fast across the ground that trying to outrun one is really quite foolish. But just because you see one 20 miles away doesn't necessarily mean it's going to hit your house. So you don't panic at the first sight of one. You watch it, you see which direction it's moving, if it's headed your way, if it's headed sideways, if it's headed away from you. And then the other question, of course, is whether or not it touches the ground, because not all tornadoes go all the way to the ground. Some of them spiral in the air a little bit, but don't come all the way down to the earth. And so there have actually been incidents of tornadoes that sort of moved along and hopped over somebody's barn and then came down and kept going again. And everyone afterward, of course, looking around going, well, if it destroyed the house, why didn't it destroy the barn? If it took your car out of your driveway, why didn't it hurt my car? And there are so many quirks to the wind currents and the effects of tornadoes that it was always this very unpredictable situation. But there was a certain proximity that you had to watch for. And not to panic, but to remain calm and clear thinking, because it may go right by you without touching you. But if it does come toward you, making sure that something is within reach that would grant safety. So if you're going to watch a tornado moving to see which way it goes, watch from the opening to the root cellar, or watch watch from the window, looking out the basement window, for example, or something like that, so that you only have to move 15 or 20 feet at the most, and you'll be in a safe location, rather than standing out in the middle of the yard as watching it go by and knowing that you have 100 feet to run before you can get to safety. It's kind of like the old adage that says, pray for sun but row toward shore. If you see a storm coming in, you're out on the lake, because you don't want to be right in the middle of the lake when the storm hits. And you hope that it'll blow by, and it might, but make sure you're close enough to shore to get to safety in case it doesn't. So there's experience, and there's stability and calmness, and knowing what to look for and when to act, and what sorts of possibilities might answer the dilemma. A lot of that comes from asking someone with experience. Well, theoretically, grandparents have lots of experience. If they have spent their lives collecting experience and collecting wisdom and collecting understanding, so that when they get to be the elders, they can be the wise elders, instead of someone who simply got old without learning anything. For the wise elders and the innovative children who respect their elders and value their elders and want to integrate a voice of experience, and the elders may be able to identify the challenge, but the youth may be able to identify a new, innovative way of answering the problem that wasn't available at the time that the grandparents were the age of the children. There are things I can talk about in my experience that are not so much a concern now because of the innovations and the advances that have been made. When I was a child, no one could have diagnosed the autism that I have, because we didn't know enough about autism at the time. The things that I went through don't have to be repeated, because we have the ability to diagnose autism in children now. And it's very easy to be proactive about these things. Easier, I'll say. It's involved, it requires dedication, but in comparison to what came before, it's easier. Let me tell you, it's much easier. That what I'm trying to point out in that, though, is not saying you should listen to me, or the child saying no, you should listen to me, but to come back to that symbiotic relationship and say we should listen to each other. We should have an intelligent dialogue, get all the information on the table, cross-check and cross-examine and measure and define and consider and put it all together, because working together, youth and age and everything in between, working together, we're always stronger than if we work alone. Kind of like in the movie The Gladiator, starring Russell Crowe, where through a complicated series of events, he winds up inside the Colosseum with all the other prisoners, and he basically informs them, if we work together, we live. If we fight separately, we die. And that's exactly how it works out in the movie. And because they work together, they all survive, which of course everybody in the stands who came to watch them get killed is horribly upset at that, because it's not the way the game is supposed to go. To which I would say, you need to find a better entertainment if you are actually entertained by people's misfortune. But it's that working together. It's understanding that there are innovations within the rising generation that are incredible and that hold so much potential and possibility. But that those innovations and resources will be more wisely used if it integrates understandings of all that came before, of the ways that the grandparents had to deal with challenges because the innovations that are now available weren't available then. And yet we have to remember those innovations. We have to remember, for example, a lot of grandparents might still remember how to make soap. what would you do if you couldn't go to the store and buy it? I wondered about that question when I was in high school and at my own initiative, because I wanted to learn how to cope. I went to the local library and discovered this amazing collection of books. I believe it was called the Foxfire books. And it was I believe, a college research project that was done in the Appalachian Mountains, where they essentially took kids who were in high school, youth who were in high school, and they went out and found the elderly people and had them explain, how do you make soap? How do you build a log cabin? How do you do this? How do you do that? And they put all this information in the Foxfire books, trying to document these understandings before they were gone. I remember reading in a newspaper column many, many years ago that each time an old person dies, it's like a library burns down. All that information is no longer available. And by having that interaction, of course, it challenged and gave opportunity to the elderly to remember things and recall things and to bring out the practices that the young people didn't know. And those practices, in the event of a flood or a tornado or some other disaster where the usual systems are broken down, the power lines are down, the phone doesn't work, the computer's off, how do we purify water enough to drink it so that we don't die of thirst? How do we find alternative sources of food to get us through the recovery spell? Having that information stored in your head means you are able to cope in ways that people who don't know any of that information aren't able to cope. The more you know, the more capable you are, the more you don't have to be afraid of life, because you can handle any challenge it throws at you. When I was thrown into a situation of, at one time trying to keep a roof over my head, I bought an old, not abandoned, but an old house that had been sitting empty for 5 years. Nobody wanted it. And it was in deplorable condition. And I finally managed to get a hold of an electrician who lived in the area, because this was at a considerable distance. And I said, as long as there is one working electrical outlet, I will be able to handle every other challenge there. And so he made sure there was one working electrical outlet. And I got to this house, and it was January, and the temperature that night plunged to minus 20 degrees. Minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Wow. And I couldn't call anyone. The cell phone had no reception. There was no telephone in the house to call anyone. I didn't know anyone there. And so my dogs and I had this challenge of, how are you going to survive till morning? Well, I suppose we could have stayed in the cab of the moving truck, but I didn't really know, how do you turn it on and turn it off and whatever to run the heater enough, but, using up all the gas. So with that one working electrical outlet, I plugged in an electric heater that I had. I pointed it underneath a large round folding table that I had, and I covered the table with blankets. And I described this to a friend at the time, and they said, oh, so basically you created a yurt inside the house. A yurt being a Tibetan sort of, Mongolian sort of tent. It's more than the camping tents that I was familiar with growing up, but it's an amazing structure that basically makes it possible to survive incredibly hostile environments. So basically by covering the table with blankets, I was able to contain the heat from this one little electric heater, and my dogs and I huddled under the table till morning, and that's how we survived the first 3 nights in this house, after which we were able to get better systems in place again. But it was because of having read various books and considered all sorts of alternatives, and having the ability to think for myself and not to depend only on the systems that were provided. If I didn't have that, what would I do? If I didn't have that, what would I do? That sort of brainstorming, in talking with youth and elderly people about the challenges they've faced, all sorts of new possibilities come to light. If the dialogue doesn't happen, that becomes the generation gap. The youth who are trying to deal with challenges that may feel overwhelming because they've never had to face that before. But it may be something very similar to what their elders have already faced and survived. And granted, it wasn't a pleasant experience, but they survived. That's the point. They were around for better things to follow. And because they knew that they could survive, they didn't have to be afraid, they didn't have to panic, they didn't have to put themselves in a box and label themselves victims of a tragedy. They could instead look in the mirror and say, I'm an overcomer. I'm a survivor. Life throws horrible things at me, and I can figure out ways to survive even that and be that much further ahead. And so as we have the generation gap, the other, being Sister Who, the other point I suppose I should bring into this is, what do you do about the spiritual generation gap? When the youth see religion as being something that's no longer relevant, and not understanding that the reason religion is there is because of the spiritual crises that people have faced. The limiter to that, however, and the distinction that I think people need to bear in mind, is that the divine is not synonymous with religion. You can experience and learn about the divine without religion, in fact, because there was a time at which the religions didn't exist and people were still having spiritual experiences, because there's something transcendent, something that, in my conception, is the embodiment of highest wisdom and greatest love, but something invisible that gives meaning and purpose to life, something that recommends love and truth over lying and hate and hatred. And the question that each person needs to face in order to become a wise elder for the tribe or the family or the community is to what extent or in what way their spiritual and or religious practices empowered them to deal with what sort of challenges. That the way their spiritual practice was able to give meaning and purpose and a sense of right and wrong to a particular situation allowed them to make a wise and constructive choice that carried them through in a way that they could still love, they could still believe in themselves, they could still believe in the possibility of good things happening. Instead of saying religion is outdated, to turn it into a question and ask it the other way around. How and when did your spiritual or religious practice help you? That becomes a fact-finding mission for the younger generation. And in a symbiotic relationship sort of way, coming from the elders, to ask and genuinely listen, why doesn't this spiritual or religious practice of mine empower you to deal with this particular situation? What is not being answered by this practice? What do you need that this is not providing? And in hearing the honest, direct truth from the youth, the elders can then consider, how does my answer need to grow to adapt to the needs and challenges of the new generation? I have all this wisdom and experience to bring to this, but if I can't figure out how it is still applicable, I have no business expecting them to embrace it. Expecting someone to embrace an answer that doesn't work makes no sense. But when I was in youth ministry training school, actually back in the mid-1980s, And everyone say, were you even alive back in the 1980s? Yes, I've been around for a very long time. But that doesn't make me old. Growing older is automatic. Growing old is a state of mind that I don't intend to ever embrace. I've often said that I want to live to be 100 and go skiing to celebrate. But the quote I was going to mention was the person who told me that a church that marries one generation becomes a widow in the next. That the church, the belief system, the spirituality, the spiritual practice, the religious practice, all of that needs to be alive and growing and adapting and evolving right in step with how life is growing and evolving and adapting. That as new challenges arise, instead of insisting on putting the Band-Aid of previous answers over it, to really look hard at whether the old answers still work, and if they don't work, why don't they work? And how can we adapt them so that we sort of update them and bring them into sync with a new time? And without losing the beauty and the value of the old, but without expecting it to do something it can't do. In one sense, there's always more to say. And of course, we always run out of time when there's only a half hour for these brief little shows. Thank you so much for watching.